My name is Sandra Moffat, and thank you for joining me for today's tutorial on how I created my womb image in Photoshop CC. I have been a photographer for over 10 years, but what I have always loved is editing. This is where I get to play and create my art. I have been creating with Photoshop for over 27 years, and I'm still discovering new buttons and different ways of doing things. With Photoshop, you will find there are many different ways to do very similar things, but as I create, I like to play, building up my colors, tones, and textures, similar to an artist applying paint to a canvas, and you will notice this as you watch me build this image today. And I encourage you to play as well. As an editor, you might see Photoshop as a tool to fix imperfections, but as an artist, you should also see it as a pathway to create and build on your vision. Before we start, I just want to quickly show you my setup for the baby and wood bowl. You will notice that the baby is comfortably laying on a beanbag and not already in the bowl. This will make it easier to digitally manipulate the bowl later on. Now I have both my photos in Photoshop. The first image I'm going to be working on is the baby, and the first thing I'm going to do is to make the baby look more curled up than it actually was. I'm going to do this by using the lasso tool to select around the bottom half of the baby. Then, by pressing Command J on a Mac or Control J on a PC, I can make a new layer of just that selection. Then, by pressing Command T for a Mac or Control T for a PC to transform the selection. This will allow me to rotate the bottom half of the baby's legs. If you lower the opacity of the layer, you can see exactly where the two images will meet. I want the baby's hand to look like it's holding its foot. While I'm doing this, I am looking over the lines where the back meets as well as the hand-foot placement. You can press the Move tool or press Enter to apply the result. Now select the legs layer and apply a mask. Zoom in on the connecting areas using your magnifying glass. Then you're going to want to choose the brush tool to start masking out the areas you don't want. Make sure that you're on the layer mask. I want to be at full opacity, and at this stage I want to use a hard brush. A black brush will remove sections of the photo, while a white brush will add portions back in. You can zoom in further if you need. Then slowly just start working your way around the image, minusing out the bits that you don't want. You can use the square brackets on the keyboard to make your brush bigger or smaller. Holding down the Shift key will create a straight line between the first mouse click and your next click. Once you're roughly happy with your selection, you can go over to your layers opacity and increase it all the way up to full opacity, so you can better see which bits you've missed and which bits still need further attention. Command 0 will zoom out to 100%. I believe that's Control 0 on a PC. Now using your brush tool, you're going to want a very soft brush. You might also want to increase your brush size, and again you're going to need a black brush working on your mask layer, and you're going to smooth out the areas to make it more difficult to see the blending. So you're just trying to really soften the edges now. You're going to want to be careful with the back area because you don't want to see a huge overlap there. It'll make it a bit more difficult later. I like to go back to the move tool when I'm finished with a certain brush, and you can also go over and turn that layer on and off to see your effect. And if you're happy, then using your Command E for a Mac or Control E for a PC, you can merge the two layers together. Now we're going to go up to the filter menu and then down to Liquify. What we're doing here is we're going to adjust the back so it looks even and not pointy from the transition that we've just made. I'm going to zoom in, then using the forward warp tool at the top, we're going to very carefully move the sides in. You don't want the pressure to be too high, so I generally keep it around the middle. Once you're happy, you can hit OK. Now we've basically finished the baby, so we can move on to creating our womb shape. So back to our bowl. Next, we're going to be using the polygonal lasso tool. Select where you want to start, and then you're going to be making a selection that is basically selecting just outside of the middle of the bowl. This is going to create our womb shape. You don't have to be too overly cautious with this selection because we are going to be fixing it and modifying it later. Once selected, you can press Command J on the keyboard, and then what that's going to do is create a new layer from your selection. Then head up to Filter, Liquify, and then we're going to start to create the shape that we need to look like a womb. Again, to make your brush bigger or smaller, just use the square brackets on your keyboard. And slowly just going around, building the shape that you're looking for. This will be modified again once the baby's in it, but this is going to give us our rough working space. Then once you're happy, hit OK. You can see how we've changed the bowl by turning the layer on and off. Selecting the background layer and the lasso tool, we're going to be making a selection around the bottom of the bowl. This is going to end up as our placenta. Command J on the keyboard will make another layer from that selection. Command T on the keyboard to transform. Basically, I've just spun it around so that it will sit at the top of our womb. Command T again to resize it. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make it roughly fit inside the top of our bowl here. Once you're happy with the rough location, you can add a mask to your layer. Using the brush tool, we are going to mask out the areas that we don't want, which is basically anything outside of our womb shape. You can use a smaller brush to tidy up any areas. I like to go just inside of the bowl rim, and that's because I want to have a slight shadow there because I want the placenta to look like it's inside the womb. Now select your black color and a large brush, and what I'm doing here is I'm just blending the placenta to my womb. So now I'm going to want to start to work on the color. So if I go into my adjustments and photo filter, I can choose a red placentary sort of color, but make sure that you increase the density, otherwise you're not really going to see it. Then I'm going to go into my brightness and contrast, and I'm going to bring the contrast down a little bit. And the reason for that is because I kind of want it to be a flat color. I feel like a placenta should be a little bit flat, but this is just personal opinion. And then I'm going to choose my history brush. Make sure that you're on your current state in the history and select multiply. What this is going to do is basically it's going to darken the area, very similar to if you used a burn tool. But I like to use the history brush because it keeps the pixels, so you won't lose any texture basically. And I'm just going around the outside to increase my shadow here. I also want to create a shadow under the lip of the placenta. So using a lower opacity and a slightly larger brush, I'm just going to paint in a little bit of shadow just here. This is just really defining the placenta. Now I'm going to want to do the same with my womb background. So I've selected the womb layer and I'm back on the history brush on multiply, and I'm just darkening through the base here. Remember, most of this is going to be behind the baby anyway. Now if I go to screen instead of multiply and go around the rim, what I'm actually doing is basically dodging. So I'm making that bit a bit brighter. But my colors are still a little off, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to the adjustments and choose color balance. I'm going to tick this box, which basically just means it's going to apply only to my womb layer. And then what I'm trying to achieve here is a warm golden sort of color. So I'll work with the midtones and the shadows. And basically I'm just sliding them until I get a color that I kind of like. And then once I'm happy, I'm going to come into my levels, and I'm just making the whole thing a little bit brighter. So I'm moving the whites across, and I'm applying that one as well to only the womb layer. So we've created a levels adjustment, and it's brighter. So what I need to do now is I need to mask out the middle, because remember I want that to be darker, not brighter. So basically I'm applying this only to the outside rim of our womb. I am using a relatively hard brush here so that I can still get a bit of a defined line between the inside and the outside of my womb. If you feel like you've gone over in an area, just select the white brush and make sure that you can bring that bit back in. Remember, a black brush removes and a light brush adds. And of course, remember to be on the masking layer. You can turn that layer on and off to see the effect and what you've done. And here I'm just going to alter it just a little bit to increase my brightness in the rim. You can see how it's no longer affecting the middle. That part is staying dark because it's been masked out. Now I've selected all the layers, and Command G basically is going to group them, and I'm going to name that womb. I can also group the placenta and name that placenta. This will just help me keep track of my layers and where everything is. Now if I turn off the womb and placenta layer and bring back up my bowl, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to create our background. I'm using the rectangular marquee tool to select a rough square, then Command J to make it its own layer. Then we're going to use Command T to transform, and I'm just going to expand this to the full outside of our area here. We want our background to be darker. We don't want it to be the focus. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go in, use our brightness and contrast, and I'm going to bring the brightness right down and our contrast right down. And this is really going to make sure that our background isn't a focal point of the image. Looking at this background, I kind of feel like it needs to be stretched a little bit, so just Command T, and I'm going to stretch that out a little bit. I've also noticed that our brightness contrast layer isn't applied to just the background, so I'm going to quickly do that now. Then I'm going to do a curves adjustment. What I'm doing here is I'm darkening the background even more, and this is going to be our shadow. So I'm going to invert my mask, Command I, and then using a soft large brush I'm going to paint in a slight shadow here. The light from my baby is coming from the top left, so I want my shadow to be bottom right. Then I'm going to do that again, creating another curves layer, but this time it's going to be my highlights. Command I will invert your layer. I made my curve brighter instead of darker, and then I'm just painted in the highlights. I just want to exaggerate them just a little bit so you can see them. To me, my background still looks a little bit bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a levels adjustment. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to darken it down quite a lot. I really don't want my background to be a focal point. But I'm going to bring my opacity down, and I'm going to change it to multiply. So basically I'm just making it darker and a little bit flatter. I really want my womb to pop. So now if I go into my hue saturation, I'm going to bring my saturation of the background down as well. And of course make sure that this layer is only applied to the background. And then I'm going to head into my photo filter, and I'm going to just warm that up, because whilst I want it to be flat, I don't want it to be cold. Then select all the layers and Command G, and we can title that one background. Looking at this image, the rim looks a little bit thick, so I'm going to go into the womb, and if you hold down Command as you hover over, it will actually select that area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Select, Modify, Contract, and start with 10, but I think it'll be more. Yes, let's go to 20. So we've contracted it by 30 overall. I think that will work. And then what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to feather it. So if I go back into Select, Modify, Feather, I'm going to feather it by about 5, and this is just going to make sure it doesn't have a hard edge. Then click the layer mask to remove that portion of the background. Now what we're going to do is we're going to turn off our 3 groups and start on just our background layer again. We're going to use the lasso tool to create a long, thin selection around the outside of our wood bowl. This wood bowl has great texture, and so we're going to be using this texture for the creation of our umbilical cord. We are going to be adjusting this later, so it doesn't have to be too neat, But if you need to add more, just click up here and you can add a little bit more selection in to anywhere that you've missed. You can also minus some out if you've got too much. Then Command J will create a new layer out of that selection, and if you turn off the background you can see what we've created. Now we're going to head up to Filter and Liquify, and we're just going to tidy up our selection just a little bit. So what I'm trying to achieve here is I'm trying to just get all one width. Again, it doesn't need to be too perfect because umbilical cords are kind of thick and thin. Once you're happy, hit OK. Now I'm going to head up to Edit and Puppet Warp. Puppet Warp's a great tool because basically you can add these pins around your shape, and then you can use these pins to basically move and warp the image to however you want it to look. So what I'm doing here is I'm just straightening our umbilical cord a little bit. You can add more pins, you can take pins away, but basically I'm just trying to straighten it out just a little bit. Then, once you're happy with the result, if you click the Move tool, you can apply or enter and apply the result. Then just Command T, I'm going to straighten this up just a little bit. I might head straight back into Liquify, Filter Liquify, and just straighten it just a little bit more. Now what I'm going to do is I actually want to create little ridges in my umbilical cord, and I'm going to do that by just pulling out small amounts in different directions. I want to create like the veins, and so I'm actually using the shadows and highlights that's already in our piece of wood to create my lumps and bumps. Just going through and doing this to our whole line. I love the textures in this wood. Then again, once you're happy, you can hit OK. Now obviously we don't have the right colors yet, so I'm going to head into our selective color palette, and what I'm trying to do here is I'm going to play around with the colors a little bit. I'm trying to create a umbilical cord colors. I want reds and blues and creams primarily. So what I'm doing is I'm using the colors of the wood and I'm just tweaking them to the colors that I want. All wood is different, so if you were going to do this on your own wood bowl, you'd have to use the sliders differently. So I'm not going to say that you have to be here or there. It's a matter of going in and playing with your magentas, your blues, your neutrals, and until you get the colors and tones that you like. And then of course, once you're done, you're going to want to apply this adjustment layer to only your umbilical cord. And then I want to still make this a little bit darker, so I'm going to head over to my hue saturations. I feel like it's a little bit pink at the moment, so I'm going to come in, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make it a little bit more red and a little bit less pink. So again, I'm just having a bit of a play. And of course, make sure that you apply that layer as well to only your umbilical cord. So I'm going to zoom in. I'm just going to take a quick look at what we've got. I'm liking the textures. Still not in love with the colors yet, but we're going to work on that now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our color balance, and I'm going to get the highlights, and I'm going to make them a little bit more golden, and I'm going to go into our shadows, and I want to bring out the blues from our veins. So that's what I'm doing. As you can see, I'm sort of just moving things around until they look visually right. There's no exact science, I'm just trying to create the colors that I like. So I might go into your brightness contrast. I might bring up the contrast a little bit and bring up the brightness as well. Like, I'm visually looking at this, and I'm just trying to create the colors and the feel. Again, don't forget to apply this to just the umbilical cord. This will all be important later. Now we're going to go into the curves, and what I want to do is I want to bring up the midtones. And the reason we're going to do this is because I want to create some highlights through the middle of the umbilical cord. Using the mask layer and a soft brush at full opacity, I'm going to minus out the outside edge of our umbilical cord. So basically what I'm doing is I'm applying this mid-tone highlight to just the middle of the umbilical cord. So I'm just going around the outside, and as I go, I'm also just minusing out a few little middle pieces, and that's going to help me with my shadows later. Again, this is all just a visual thing, so as I go around, I'm just adding bits and taking bits out as I go to visually make it look right. So what I'm doing is I'm actually removing some of the highlights from where I want some of the shadows to be. And actually I'm going to try and make them a little bit darker. So I might go into my levels adjustment, and I'm just going to bring my blacks or my shadows, and I'm just going to bring them up a little bit, and I'm going to take my midtones and I'm going to make them a little bit darker as well. Then using Command I, I'm going to invert the layer mask so that I can use a white brush to paint in my shadows here. Again, it's a soft brush. I am working at 100%, but that's because I didn't make my shadows too dark just then. You can see what I'm doing is I'm actually enhancing the dark parts of the wood. Now if I go into levels again, and this time I'm going to bring up my highlights, same thing, invert my layer mask, Command I, and then white brush Same settings, I'm just going to add in my highlights. And you can see it beginning to take a bit of shape now. Now if I grab all those layers and Command G, group it together and call it umbilical cord. So now I have my 4 elements. I have a background, a womb, a placenta, and an umbilical cord. But now as I've turned them all back on, I can see my umbilical cord is way too big, so I'm just going to Command T, and I'm just going to make it thinner so that it looks like it will suit my womb a little bit better, and I think that will work. But also looking at my umbilical cord next to my placenta, I feel like the colors are a little bit off. So what I might do is I might grab my levels and I might make it just a little bit darker, making sure again it's only applied to the umbilical cord, not to the whole image. And then I might go into my photo filter and I might add a little bit more of the same red that I added to the placenta, just so there's a little bit of uniformity there. But I'll bring that opacity down just a little bit, and I'm going to multiply it, but bring the opacity down. That's giving me that rich, dark sort of red color that I've been trying to achieve. And I'm pretty happy with that, so I'm going to head back into our baby image and I want to sharpen this. So I'm going to duplicate the layer, Command J, filter, other, high pass. Now this is 4.6 is roughly what I normally use, so I'm just going to apply that. And then if I go down into soft light, so I'm applying a soft light to that layer, and what that actually does is that's going to sharpen the baby just a little bit. You can kind of see it as I turn it on and off. It just has a subtle sharpening. So now Command 0 will zoom me out, select both layers, and Command E to combine them. And then I'm just going to bring over our baby layer into our womb, so I can start building the two of them together. So I can see what I'm doing. I'm just going to bring the opacity of that layer down and Command T, so that now I can see the womb underneath and I can see the baby, and I can move it around and rotate it just a little bit to get it into a womb-like position. Just moving it around until I think it visually looks right. And then applying that. Now I'm going to bring the opacity up, edit, puppet warp. So I'm just going to put a few more pins in this baby, and I'm just going to warp the baby around to look a little bit more curved. You've got to be really careful with people and faces. You can't puppet warp too much, so be really subtle when you're using that, and then hit apply when you're happy. And if I bring down the opacity, you can kind of see that the baby's starting to fit a bit better, but Command T, I'm just going to rotate a little bit until I get it sort of just right. Okay, so now add a mask to that layer because we're going to start removing some of the background from the baby. You'll need a medium hard brush, and it'll have to be quite large, and obviously we're going to be painting with the black, and we're just minusing out some of this background and definitely removing it from the rim of the womb. We want it to be all clear of there for sure. Now if I increase the opacity, you can kind of see if there's any bits you've missed, and we can zoom in. And I'll just bring that opacity down again so I can see the background. And I'm going to start working on the placenta, because obviously the placenta is coming through the head, which we don't want to happen. So if I go into Filter Liquify, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a bump for where the head's going to be. So I'm just sort of moving our placenta around and visually creating a bump. If I turn on the backdrop, show backdrop, then I can kind of see if I'm working in the right area or not. I want it to look like the head sort of is pushed into the placenta a little bit and creating a bit of a dent. Hit OK, and then you can kind of see what we've done here. Now, using the brush tool, I'm going to start to remove the backdrop from off the placenta, because there'd be no shadow there, it wouldn't be dark. So I just want to make sure it's off the top of the placenta, and I'm also feathering it down around the base of the baby, so it's harder to see where it starts and it stops. If I swap it to a white brush, a large white brush, and working on a low opacity, I'm just feathering this shadow created by the black backdrop out a little bit, so it's harder to see where it starts and it stops. I wanted to hit the underside of the placenta because that's basically, this is helping me create some of my shadows, so I don't have to cut the baby out perfectly. I'm using the black backdrop to my advantage here. And just pull the opacity all the way up and get rid of that bit that I missed. Do a quick lap around to make sure that there's nothing else that I missed. Don't want any stray lines. Okay, so that's starting to blend quite nicely. Command O zooms you out. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to create a levels adjustment, and I want to get rid of the highlights. I want to create a shadows layer for our baby. So I'm going to remove the highlights, and I'm removing, making the midtones darker, and I'm going to invert that mask, and I'm going to be painting in a shadow over the legs and bottom of the baby. And what this is going to do is it's going to make it look like the baby's inside rather than sitting on top. So basically I'm just using a soft brush, and I'm going to bring my opacity down just a little bit, and I'm just painting in this very soft shadow. And this is important if you want the baby to look like it's actually laying down inside of something. If I turn that on and off, you can see. And I'm just going to zoom in. I want this shadow just to come into the base down there a little bit. Just checking to make sure all the shadows look good. Command 0 will zoom me out. And now I'm going to select our womb again, filter, liquify, and what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to start to build the womb around the baby. So I want it to look squashed and tight in there, so I'm just going to very delicately bring the womb down just a little bit to play with the shape and make it look like it's a tight fit. I still feel like the outside of my womb rim is a little bit thick, so I'm just going to use the command tool as I hover over the layer to select that part of the image, and then I'm going to use the quick select tool and minus out the selected area that I don't want. And then modify, contract, same as before. We'll go 20 again. I'm going to delete the mask that was already on there, and the reason is so I can create a new mask from the selection we just had. Now if I zoom in, I'm just going to take a look at this area. What I might do is I'm going to grab a brush and using a black medium hard brush, I'm just going to feather this edge just a little bit and tidy it up. I don't want it to be perfect because it's a womb. I want it to look a little bit out of shape, and then I can start to create the little line in the womb, which will end up being the opening of where the baby can come out. So all I'm doing is I'm masking out part of the womb and allowing the background to come through. I'm feathering that by using a low opacity brush, and I'm just building up a look that looks nice. Now if I bring my brush back to full opacity, and I'm just going to go around this edge just a little bit more. It's still a soft brush, and it's just going to make the womb edge or rim not look so harsh and cut out. So I'm just quickly going around the edge here. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to tidy up the edge of our placenta a little bit. And then I'm going to get our dodge tool, and I'm going to work on the shadows only. I've got an exposure of 24, and that looks about right. So make sure that you're on the placenta layer, and I'm just gonna burn that edge in a little bit more. Command 0 to zoom out. And now I can collapse the placenta layer, and I'm going to move my umbilical cord grouping to the top. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate it, so Command J and then Command E to combine all the layers together. I've turned off our original umbilical cord grouping so that we don't lose that, and now I'm going to edit Puppet Warp, and using our pins, we're going to place one in the top and one in the bottom. I'm going to put one end where I want it to finish and the other end where I want it to start. And this is how we're basically going to start to build our umbilical cord. So as you add more pins in and you move the pins around, it starts to puppet warp the shape of an umbilical cord. What I'm doing is I'm just placing pins in and moving it around until I find a realistic shape that I kind of like. So all I'm going to do is just keep manipulating it and working with it until I'm happy. What I don't want is I don't want the cord to look like it's coming out of an inappropriate area, or I don't want it to look like it's going into the back of the baby's head. So there are some things that I'm trying not to do, but otherwise I really just want it to work with the overall design. I on purpose did not choose to make it come out through the legs, and the main reason for that is because it could be misconstrued as something else. So I definitely don't want my image to look like that. This is getting really close to something that I like and I feel is kind of realistic. So I'm just going to apply that, and there we have our shape. But looking at it, our umbilical cord is definitely too bright for the rest of the image. So I'm just going to darken that down by using a levels adjustment. I'm getting the midtones, I'm making them a little bit darker, and I'm bringing our highlights down just a little bit. Looking at the overall image, it just felt a little bit too bright, so I'm just making this quick little adjustment. Now if I go onto the umbilical cord layer and add a mask, now if I zoom in, I'm going to use that mask to paint out, so using a black brush, the bits that are overlapping and shouldn't be there. I'm using a hard brush here, and I'm just removing the excess bits. Remembering you can make your brush larger or smaller using your square brackets. Now I'm going to create another levels adjustment layer, and it's going to be another really dark one, so it's going to be a shadow. So I'm going to pull the darks in, the midtones, make them darker, and I'm going to remove a lot of the highlights. I'm going to invert my layer, so Control I, and now what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to start painting in my shadows on the umbilical cord. I'm going to use a soft brush, and so any part of the umbilical cord that should be darker, like the bit that's going behind the back or the bit that's coming out from the tummy, I'm just going to darken those bits, and this is going to give it a more realistic look. Take your time here and think about where the shadows should be as you do it. Play with the opacity. So by having a smaller opacity, you can just sort of work it into the image. By making sure that this layer is applied only to the umbilical cord, you don't have to be neat, you won't end up colouring outside the lines. So where this crosses over, I want it to look like the other ones on top. So I'm just going to build this shadow through here. And that's just going to help to give it a little bit of depth. Remembering our light is coming from the top left of the image, so I want the shadows more to hit from the bottom right. I'm also adding in a few shadows where there would be kinks in the umbilical cord as I go. And this is just going to help create and build the texture. Just taking my time here. Build it up slowly, add a little bit, then add a little bit more. And then what you're going to do is the same thing, but this time it's going to be for the highlights. So we're going to move the highlights up in this levels adjustment, and we're going to remove some of the shadows. Again, we're going to invert the mask, Command I, and this time we are going to be painting in where the highlights would go. So they're going to sit towards the top left of the image. If I zoom out, I can take a look at that, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add now another levels adjustment. Again, this is going to be another shadows, but this time it's actually going to be the shadow created by the umbilical cord. So I've inverted the mask again, Command I, and this time I want to be zoomed out because I kind of want to see how it goes as I'm building it. But using a soft, low opacity brush, I'm building the shadow that the umbilical is creating on the baby. Because it's low opacity, I can build it up. I can make it darker in some areas and lighter in some areas. The other thing I can do is while I'm selected on the background mask, I can blur that. So I can go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and then I'm just going to give it a little bit more of a blur than I currently have. And then I'm going to continue to build up my shadow a little bit more. I'm using a low opacity brush, and that's why I can go over it several times, creating darker areas and lighter areas. I've just applied the blur again, and that's just helping me to feather the look. Now I'm just going to build up my darker areas. And I just keep going until it sort of looks right. And then I'm going to name that layer Shadow. If I can spell right, let me just fix that. There we go. Looking at my umbilical cord, it seems a little bit bright compared to the rest of the image, so I'm just going to quickly jump in and do a hue saturation adjustment, and I'm just going to bring the saturation down just a little bit to come in line with the rest of the image. Again, make sure it's applied to just the umbilical cord, and then select all of the layers for our new umbilical cord and group them together, Command G, and call it umbilical cord 2. So we have an edited and an unedited one. Now I'm going to go into the womb layer. I'm going to create a curves adjustment. I'm going to make it a little bit darker, so I'm going to bring down the midtones. And what I'm actually doing here is I'm just bringing down some of the highlights to the rim. And I'm applying it to just the womb layer. Now I'm going to go into the background and I'm going to create another curves adjustment. Again, I'm going to make it darker. So this is for the background this time because I really felt like it was still too bright. So what I'm doing is I'm going to go into our gradient fill and I'm just going to feather it out from the bottom. So basically I'm making the top left just a little bit darker, a little bit more moody. Now, if I close those groups, I'm going to be creating another shadow, but this time it's for the baby. So I'm back in the curves layer. I've brought down the midtones and the highlights. I'm going to use a large soft brush. And what I'm doing is I'm minusing out the face and head of the baby. So that way it looks like the light is hitting the baby's face, and I'm going to apply that so it's just hitting the baby and not the background. And I also want this to look like it's on the umbilical cord as well, so I'm just going to duplicate that layer, Command J, and I'm just going to move it down into the umbilical cord and apply it to the umbilical cord. Now I'm going to go into my library and pull out my signature. I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller. Now obviously it's black, so we can't see it. So what I need to do is go into our effects, color overlay, and I'm actually just going to choose a part of the rim, make it a little bit brighter, hit OK, and there we have it, our finished womb shot. Thanks so much for joining me for this tutorial, and I hope that I was able to show you something you didn't know. If you have any questions, please feel free to join the conversation on the Newborn Photography Facebook group, and I hope to see and hear from you all very soon.